So 2020 hasn't been really that great of a year, but I found that because of spending about 8 months or so in lockdown, I've had a lot of time to read books. And so I thought I'd just do a quick rundown of the 20 books that I actually managed to read this year. So I read a couple of Mishima books this year, and I think the thing that he is best at is creating this view into what a disturbed mind would look like. And obviously, Mishima, he had a weird history himself, and of course his suicidal death. That's something that really comes across in the writing that he does. And I think Temple of the Golden Pavilion is a really good look at that, and just the bizarre connections and ways that someone like that would think. Overall, it's a bit aimless. There's a lot of scenes that don't really link up, and though it eventually does boil to a peak, it does get a bit lost along the way. So as an LGBT person myself, I'm always interested in reading books that come from that sphere, come from authors who are that, or who write characters about that. And so I was kind of looking forward to reading The Emperor Waltz, but it's a bit of a hodgepodge, unfortunately. It has this weird idea where it keeps trying to show different characters across different parts of time, from the build-up to World War II, to people in 80s London, to people in the far future, to people in the far past. And the problem is that these stories do not go together and they do not complement each other. Like, you spend the first section in Weimar, but then it's over 100 pages of different characters until you get back to that. And by that point, I don't care about those characters anymore. And I understand that he was trying to go for this grand symphony of all these characters lead up to each other, but really that just amounts to a character in one timeline has referenced an object from a character from another timeline. And I don't really care about that. They should have been separate stories, and they don't form a cohesive whole together. So the Memories of Earth's Past trilogy is really great, partially because each novel is its own separate thing. So Three Body Problem was a mystery thriller, then it becomes a political thing in The Dark Forest, and then Death's End is sort of a bizarre space opera. And I like that by the time he got to Death's End, Cixin Liu was very much just, we're going to throw every concept, every mathematical or scientific idea we have at the wall. People are turned into 2D, people go at the speed of light, they go through time, they go into extra dimensions, and I just love the ridiculousness of it. And then in the middle of that, he'll suddenly change everything, put everything to a halt, and bring in the idea of a fairy tale that's being told. But the fairy tale has hidden meanings and different scientific concepts in that. And it's a masterwork of different ideas being thrown together with different styles. And they all complement each other, and they all add like something interesting to the story. So I think the Tartar Steppe is an interesting idea on the people putting off things or putting off their lives so that they're waiting for glory. And it captures that feeling of the fear of missing out. But I feel like it's a bit weak in its overall message. Like, the guy, he's staying at this place waiting for something amazing to happen. But then when he tries to leave, he wants to leave, but he's forced to stay. And that kind of undermines the whole message of, oh, he's just wasted his life. So I think the Bamboo Stalk is a really interesting look into Kuwait and the Arabian Peninsula, because you don't really see any literature coming from that area. I know that there is some, but I don't really see much of it translated into English. And it's interesting to see kind of critique of that society coming from someone within that society, especially looking at the whole culture of migrant workers and the way they are viewed by the people in the countries that they go to work in. And it lags a bit during its opening in the Philippines, but it becomes very targeted once the story gets to Kuwait, and it's a really interesting thing to read. So I read this book entirely within one day. It's definitely a page-turner. It has a really great pace. The plot never stops. It does get a bit too hard on the whimsy of it all. You get the sense that everything's a bit too twee. It's a bit, oh, she gets lost in the snow. Tonally, that's not as interesting, but the overall mystery of it is very engaging. I'm a big fan of Kurt Vonnegut, and I really like his books, but I think that early Vonnegut doesn't really work as well as some of his later stuff, because he was way too much knowledgeably wacky. He's like, oh, he goes into the chronotastic fantabulum, and it's just a bit too on the nose. It doesn't have his subtle humor that he shows later. This book has a great beginning, but it really lags in the middle, and the ending, and the twist at the ending is really hilarious, but I put it down for several months in the middle because it just loses all pace and momentum. That being said though, Cat's Cradle is a masterwork. Everything that was wrong with Sirens of Titan is somewhat fixed in Cat's Cradle. Cat's Cradle is just perfectly paced. You get this constant doling of information, the constant change, the constant progression of the plot, and it manages to weave in the sense of Americanness that permeates all of Vonnegut's work. This feels like a very American book, that it's attacking American ideals and how America sees itself in the world. And that's just intrinsically more interesting to read. This is also where you can see that he began to really perfect his style of more irreverent humor. It's not, oh, we're just wacky. It's more a dark humor, a black comedy almost. I really like Ismail Kadare's work, and it's always interesting to see something that comes from Albania. And this is a really interesting book in that it's about the analysis of dreams, and it feels like a dream in itself. The location where everything takes place is this weird dreamlike maze. You get these bizarre images thrown at you that you have to analyze yourself. There's this air of mystery and fog that kind of permeates everything. Everything is confined to like 1 or 2 rooms, but then at the same time it feels unimaginable in its scale. So I'm aware that history of the Balkans in general is something that's kind of contested by different viewpoints. You have the viewpoint of outside Europe, then you have the viewpoint of the people who live in the Balkans themselves, and oftentimes the people of the Balkans are portrayed in a very biased way. And so with this book, I do have to take in mind that it is trying to project kind of an angle to the history. But the angle that I get from it is that foreign powers, for the most part, were influencing the direction of the Balkans, really without any consideration to the people who lived there. It's a much more sympathetic take on the people who live in that disputed region, rather than other viewpoints such as Tony Blair's, who kind of characterize the Balkans as just an inherently violent place. Turns out while I was editing this, I realized that I had actually forgotten to talk about one of the books this year. So, long story short, not all travelogues are created equally, and this one was so uninteresting that I managed to forget about it in my own review of it. So, going back to Mishima, this has many of the same good points and bad points as Temple of the Golden Pavilion. I think the primary good point is the constant sense of building tension. You always know that something bad is going to happen, but you're never really quite sure, and it just steadily creeps along, and it's a great look into the disturbed mind and the disturbed viewpoints that people have. But at the same time, it just kinda drags a bit at times, and you're always like, okay, is this going to go somewhere? The scenes feel a little bit disjointed. This might be one of my favorite books that I've ever read at this point. This is one of the weirdest first-person narratives that I've ever seen out of a book. And I just love... I love the utter inhumanity, but at the same time, humanity of the character. Where you're reading a person say this, but it also feels like someone who willingly wants to become a machine of capitalism. And it's a really interesting critique of the kind of society and the way that society says, you should be doing this, you should be wanting this, and you should aspire to this. And it really just says, well, this is what I want to do, and why is this not as valid as anything else? And it's just really hilarious to read. So when I started reading this, I had seen it recommended on Reddit, as most books are. And I think I was reading it and people were saying that this was like a highlight of German literature. And I think I learned to enjoy it a lot more when I started viewing it as more of just like a trashy, like pulpy novel. Because it's just it's hilarious in how ridiculous everything about it is. It's a serial killer who just loves smells. The more ridiculous that it gets, the more entertaining that it is. And it's interesting in that he really doesn't start killing towards the end, and most of it is just his obsession with smells. And I think this leads into one of the main problems with it, that it goes way too overboard on descriptions. There's so many pages that are devoted entirely to descriptions, and after a point you just start skipping through that. And when it gets to the end, the ending is brilliantly weird, but it does get bogged down in the middle where the whole plot just stops so that he can talk about his favorite smells for like 50 pages. If Convenience Store Woman is one of my favorite books, this might be my favorite book ever. This is one of the most ridiculous books that I've ever read. I first became aware of this book from the movie November, which is an Estonian folk horror movie. And it was based on a book by Andrus Kirovic, and this is a book by the same author. And this is just a perfect blending of weird story plus all of Estonian folklore. And I love that magical realism where people just live side by side with the weird creatures, the talking snakes, and it's these weird ideas mixed with a perfect coming-of-age story that comments on the changing society of Estonia. From modernization, people being stuck in their old ways, the influence of religion, of kind of globalization, and it's a really interesting, multifaceted viewpoint of all of these issues together and how they kind of impose themselves on the youth of Estonia. Well, you know, Estonian fiction is great, but unfortunately their history just isn't that interesting. So I read Axiom's End in the way that you really should, which is I read all but the last 40 pages in one day, and then I didn't read the last 40 pages for about another week. I was unsure of what it was going to be like when I first started it because it felt very on the nose 2008, where it's like, look how 2008, it's fergalicious. But it picked up very quickly, and I soon just started absolutely loving it. I love that even though the plot itself isn't the most fast-paced, it has great doling of information, and so you're always learning something new. So even if things aren't technically happening, you're always learning more and more about the motivations of the characters, and that keeps it really engaging and interesting. This is also a nice entry into the fabled horny for the monster genre of fiction, and I have to say I am fully in support of that. I really like the works of Walter Moors, like Captain Blaubeer, and actually that's a lot of the way I was able to learn to read German in the first place. And so when I read this is the first book that I've ever read in German without any translation. And I really like it. It's a really great standalone novel in his Zamonia world, and it's got a great atmosphere that's different from a lot of the other books in that it's much more overtly dark, and even though it does have comedic elements, they're kind of brought down in favor of more of like a moody gothic atmosphere. And I love the characters, I love the illustrations. The only problem I have is descriptions. Walter Moors is obsessed with descriptions, and the problem is that this gets to the point where it's not moving the plot at all. You're not learning more about the characters. It's like, oh, we had dinner and we ate this and this and this and this and this wine was from here. And you're not learning about the characters, you're not learning about the world, you're just learning about the meal they ate. And that really bogs down the pace, and it really detracts from what is overall a really interesting and engaging book. So I've already reviewed this book in a previous video. Do not read this book. This book is evil. This book is the devil. And I don't want to be too harsh ultimately, like, I don't find it particularly funny, but obviously this is something that Germany really likes. And yeah, there ultimately isn't that much to say about it. If you like it, read it. If you don't like it, don't. Okay, we're making it to the end here. So this one, it's interesting to read The Left Hand of Darkness in 2020 because as a book that came out in the 60s, all of its views on non-binary gender and asexuality and intersexuality is really, it must have been very revolutionary when it first came out. But reading it now, where you can watch a video on YouTube by someone who's non-binary or someone who's transgender, it doesn't really have the same effect. Like, I'm sure it was revolutionary at the time it came out, but reading it now, it's like, been there, done that. I can already read all of these viewpoints. And so you have to judge the book less on how much of an impact it would have made and more of just the general traits of the book itself. And like, overall the plot is interesting, and I like the characters and I like to follow them, but it just feels like there's a lot of fat within the book. There's a lot of descriptions of places, and especially it's that high fantasy of everyone has a long name, everything has its own specific name, that they don't really add anything for me. You could have set this on an alternate Earth and it would have been just as interesting. In fact, maybe more if it didn't have all the baggage of we have to describe this, we have to describe this, we have to describe this. I think you're sensing a theme that I don't really like a lot of description. And yeah, I feel like ultimately this is something that would have been much more impactful when it first came out. And it's still an interesting read now, but I think a lot of that shock is kind of lost on the 2020 crowd. Well, so that's all for this video. That's all for this year. So, like, comment, subscribe. Did you read any of these books? What did you think of them? And I'll see you next year.